All right, let's get right into it. The day before Thanksgiving, a day when the country is supposed to be coming together, the heart of Washington, D.C. was rocked by gunfire. What unfolded wasn't just a crime scene. It kicked off a massive federal investigation and a huge national debate. And the initial reports were just shocking. Two members of our own National Guard had been shot. And we're not talking about miles away. This happened literally steps from the White House. You have to understand just how quickly this all went down. At 2:15 in the afternoon, shots ring out. Just minutes. We're talking minutes later, law enforcement is on the scene, there's an exchange of fire, and they have a suspect in custody. And right after that, boom, the entire area goes into lockdown. The White House, federal buildings, everything sealed. So what do we actually know about this attack? Let's break down exactly how this shootout happened in the middle of the day, right in the heart of the nation's capital. And this is just heartbreaking. The victims weren't random people. They were two National Guardsmen, both from West Virginia, serving on a special task force to provide security in D.C. One, a woman, was shot in the chest. Her colleague, a man, was shot in the head. Both were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, fighting for their lives. So you can imagine, with the victims being cared for, the focus just completely shifted. The question on absolutely everyone's mind was who would do this and why? Well, the answer to that question wasn't found in D.C. It would take investigators all the way back to a war zone thousands of miles away in Afghanistan, and then right back to Washington. Okay, so authorities identify the suspect as 29-year-old rahmanlala Lakanwal. He's originally from Afghanistan, and he came to the U.S. back in 2021. He came in under a program called Operation Allies Welcome, which was set up after American forces pulled out of Afghanistan. Since then, he'd been living all the way across the country in Washington state. And this is exactly why investigators are saying this was anything but random. I mean, look at the evidence. It points to a really calculated plan. He traveled all the way from the West Coast. He apparently waited for these specific guards. He attacked, and then he tried to make a quick getaway using the metro. Get this, he didn't even have an ID on him, which obviously makes things a lot harder for police. So let's put the pieces together, right? The targets were military personnel. The location was right next to the White House, and then you have the suspect's background. It becomes pretty clear why this wasn't being treated as just another crime. The FBI took the lead right away, opening an investigation into this as a potential act of terrorism. Now, when you're faced with a potential terror attack in the Capitol, you'd expect a strong response, and that is exactly what we got. It was swift, it was forceful, and it came from all levels. Law enforcement officials were out there giving press conferences, and they wanted to send a very clear message. They said they were bringing together the full force of every agency involved, and they promised that whoever was responsible would be brought to justice. And the response wasn't just from current officials. Former President Donald Trump, who had actually ordered that National Guard unit into D.C., he put out a statement with some incredibly strong words, calling the shooter an animal and promising he would pay a very steep price. And look, this wasn't just talk. To back up those words and send a very visible message, an extra 500 National Guard troops were immediately deployed to Washington, D.C. It was a tangible show of force meant to beef up security right away. Okay, so once that initial shock started to wear off and the investigation got going, a much bigger question started to bubble up. How does a country even begin to process something like this? And what happened next is what almost always happens in these situations. The national conversation just split right down the middle, fracturing into two totally different debates. It really came down to a question of who did it versus how they did it. Let me show you what I mean. On one side, you have the who debate. This conversation was all about the shooter, his immigration status, how he got into the country, the vetting process, and whether this was terrorism. But then on the other side, you had the how debate, and that one was focused squarely on the weapon, America's gun laws, the Second Amendment, and how this guy was able to get a firearm to begin with. One senior leader really captured that first argument, the who debate, with a pretty simple analogy. He asked, if there's a kid who has a stick, and if he starts hitting everybody with the stick, who do you blame? The stick or this kid? The point being, the problem isn't the tool, it's the person using it. But here's the thing that analysts were quick to point out. When the focus becomes so intense on the individual, their background, their motives, it often means that the bigger, way more complicated conversation about gun violence and access to weapons, well, it tends to get pushed to the side yet again. And so, as the entire nation hopes for the recovery of those two brave guardsmen, the rest of us are left right back here wrestling with this same fundamental, unresolved question that haunts us after every single one of these tragedies. When something terrible like this happens, where does the problem really lie? Is it the weapon, or is it the person who picks it up?